it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Part 4. We arrived at the university roughly 2 hours and 15 minutes later. We exited the car and made our way into the building. I'd taken a well-earned nap in the car journey up to Denver. It had already been a long day, and it was only 1 p.m. We made small talk as we walked down the halls of the 155-year-old building. I opened up first. "So, who is this person? How do you know her?" I asked curiously, honestly surprised where Bodkins was pulling this from. Bodkins was a good agent, solid legwork as a former homicide detective for Iowa PD before he came to the Bureau, but still he didn't strike me as the university type. Professor Ruth Maddock, PhD in both psychopathy and criminology, specializes in sexual violence crimes. She teaches seminars here to the upcoming academics. Meanwhile, conducts research on the criminal mind. I met her when I was dealing with a serial rapist known as the Davenport Ripper a number of years back. Well, I was out of my depth, Quince. I was used to drug deals gone wrong and wives who got sick of their cheating husbands. I didn't know how to approach these crime scenes. Someone in the state crime lab recommended her, telling me that a few detectives from nearby states like Wyoming, Kansas, South Dakota, well, they'd consult with her on similar cases. Sounds like quite a woman, I confessed. She is. We got together with the case files. She informed me that the ferociousness of the rape was not exclusively an indicator that the perp knew the victim personally. She hypothesized that the unsub was likely a married man, chastised and cuckolded by a promiscuous wife. The victims were his fantasy of what he'd like to do to his wife, but didn't have the balls to do due to the hold she had over him. Did you catch him? I was actually really intrigued. Yeah, 2 more bodies dropped. We saw that the women were all white, similar ages, blonde hair. They all had some type of cosmetic surgery to enhance their beauty. Fake breasts, Botox, tummy tucks, and so on. Anyway, she deduced that the unsub was likely a small, weak-looking man. Otherwise, his violence would be aimed towards the men who slept with his wife. She also told me that most sexually motivated criminals tend to return to the scene of their crimes. If the unsub was unable to have normal sexual releases due to his toxic marriage, his impotency and feelings of sexual inadequacy, and finding it difficult to lure another victim, well, then he may return to the scene of a kill to relive the power and control he felt and the elation of the release. I didn't say anything, but my eager face told Bodkins I was hooked. Well, he killed 6 by this point. It took a lot of manpower, but we staked out those sites after the timeline between the murders suggested he was struggling to find a new victim, probably due to everyone being on high alert. One night, we were parked up at Rock Island National Cemetery. It was 3:23 a.m. Me and my partner dozing off when we realized there's someone in the trees. We catch the guy masturbating, holding the 3rd victim's necklace. "You're kidding?" I asked, slightly amused. "Nope. So, this is why I think if there's anyone that we should bring in to help us with the Showtime killer, it should be Professor Maddock. She'll be able to interpret Cassidy's insights better than I ever could anyway," Bodkins said, modestly. "Okay, you're a good agent, Dave. You just had a wobble, that's all, and an understandable wobble, too," I assured him, easing his pride, and his smile told me he appreciated that as we came close to the lecture hall where the receptionist told us we'd find the professor. A criminology seminar on child psychopathy. "Besides," I added, causing Bodkins to pause for a brief second to heed what I had to say. He raised his eyebrows to indicate he was all ears. "A young and professionally successful white woman. Well, she's just Cassidy's type," I said with a cheeky wink as I pushed the door. We entered the room. Ruth Maddock was as strikingly beautiful as she was clearly smart. I imagine when it came to those student-teacher fantasies, a huge percent of her male students, and hell, probably some of the female students too, were indulging right this second. She wore her glasses seductively halfway down her nose. Her blood-red hair with natural brown tints flowed into a bobble and poured down her back like a silky waterfall. With each tap of her black 5-inch heels on the stage, each mesmerized student's heart skipped a beat. Their eyes glared at the black leather straps hugging her beautiful, smooth legs, and each of them felt an intense spout of jealousy over her own footwear. Her pencil skirt embraced her figure tight, whilst her blazer equally caressed her fitted red shirt. The collar of her blouse was buttoned up just enough to look classy among her colleagues, but unbuttoned just enough to make some heads turn, and stay turned until she was out of view. She was just finishing her lecture when we entered the room. On the large screen behind her on stage was a slide that appeared to be a philosophical question. Made or born?
So guys, what we've deduced today is that these sorts of perpetrators start their compulsions very young. The question, though, are these types of compulsions brought on by the child's negative experience? Or are they already present and the experiences are simply what determine what type of compulsion the perp has? That's what I'd like your papers to be on. For reading material, I'd recommend Adrian Raine's Violence and Psychopathy, The Mask of Sanity, and The Current Trends of Criminal Psychopathy. Thank you. You may leave. Have a great weekend, guys.
She began to turn off the slideshow as the students rose from their seats and made their way past us up the aisle. Bodkins and her made eye contact, and they waved pleasantries at each other as we made our way down to her. As I walked down, a student barged into me, causing her to drop her textbooks. I was ashamed to say I was too busy trying to keep my tongue from rolling out of my mouth to watch where I was going. The impact and noise of hardback books hitting auditorium steps was enough to snap me out of my lusting daydream. I apologized in an obligatory manner and began to pick up the textbooks, praying Professor Maddock hadn't seen that. "Oh my God! Agent Quince!" the female student exclaimed. I looked up, wondering how on earth this person knew who I was. "Oh my Lord!" I exclaimed, bursting into a chuckle at how amazingly small the world could be at times. "Ashley Benning? What are you—" I decided, after everything that happened, I wanted to do what you guys do. I'm studying criminal psychology, forensic psychiatry, and criminology. Maybe one day I'll be calling you boss, she chuckled. Well, you'd make a phenomenal agent. If you're anything like your mom, you'll do really well. My comment made her face change from happy-go-lucky to sulky teen. Ugh. She brought that psycho into our lives in the first place. Had a freaking baby with him and everything. Drove my dad away. Just because she had him arrested doesn't make her anything special. Her arms were now folded, and she turned away from me to scowl. I couldn't help but smile. Ooh, touchy subject, huh? Didn't realize you two didn't get on. No, I partly came out here to get away from her. We haven't spoken much ever since she threw my dad out. Well, she said some horrible things about him in the courtroom. Said he was a terrible man who abused her, but yet, well, then she shacks up with Michael Myers. My dad was right. She is deluded. I could tell Ashley's father had turned her against Amy. Well, the thing is, I'd met both Jeff and Amy, and I knew who I believed. I didn't entertain the drama, though. Well, look, neither of my parents are with me anymore, Ash. Don't spend your life hating one of them. Cassidy could have easily killed your mother that day. The way she looked at the floor and flexed her eyebrows showed me there was a part of her that knew I was right. So, what are you doing here anyway? What's possibly here in Color... Oh, you've been to see him, she said, an edge to her tone. I nodded. Well, I'm, fairly new to the BSU. Up until I met you, I worked organized crime amongst other things. I don't have much field experience, especially not on my own, and Rodriguez is working on a special task force right now, so it's just me and Bodkins, I said with a shrug of modesty. So, what's Robert had to say for himself then? She asked with suspicion. I leaned in close so no one could hear. Sure you've heard of the Showtime killer? I asked, speculatively. And she nodded. The home invader, yeah? It's got a lot of people shaken up. 3 murders, all different states. You could strike anywhere next. There's nothing scarier than the thought of someone creeping into your house at night with sick intentions. In fact, a lot of the other students here are that obsessed. They're doing their thesis on it, she confessed. Yeah, well, he's very good. Very good. He's not leaving any DNA, so we need to build a psychological profile of the killer. We're trying to get Robert Cassidy to tell us things that no one seems to know about his past. Now, I can't go into specifics, as you know, but we're hoping with that info we can speed up the process. We're hoping your professor will help out too, I said, looking at Ruth Maddock once again. I wasn't able to look away, and Ashley smiled at me as she noticed. Yep, she's a fox, she said, smirking at me. Well, I snapped out of it, and I smirked back. Look, I shall have you know I'm here in a totally professional capacity, I said facetiously. We shared a look and a grin. It's been really good to see you, Ash. I'm going to be in Denver frequently over the next few weeks. Here, it'll be nice to have a coffee and catch up. See how you're really doing, I said, handing her my card. Absolutely. Hey, you best get down there. Looks like your partner won't let Professor Maddock get a word in, she said, looking down at the stage as Bodkin spat pure fire at Ruth Maddock, as she simply nodded along. He already scared off the most dangerous serial killer on the planet today with his big mouth. If I hang up here any longer, he'll scare her off as well. We shared a chuckle, said our goodbyes, and I jogged down the now empty steps towards Bodkins and Maddock. So anyway, I stood up, pointed at him, and told him, You're not special, you're nothing. And he just loses it, starts crying like a little bitch, and storms out of the interview. You see, people like Cassidy think they're tough and dangerous, but really, they just need a man to stand up to them. Well, I'll give it to Bodkins. He really sold his serial killer spanking story well. Puffed his chest out like Superman and everything. So yeah, that's why we're here. We think it's wise that Agent Bodkins doesn't sit in the next interview because Robert Cassidy is absolutely freaking terrified of him, I joked. And Ruth Maddock's chuckle at my humor honestly made my knees melt. Bodkin's face turned to fury, but it is best to check himself and chuckle along with us to save face.
You must be Special Agent Quince? I've read about your arrest of Robert Cassidy. That was quite the achievement. I must say, it's an honor to meet you.
Ruth Maddock held out her hand, and I shook it gently. I smiled and modestly waved off her compliment. Well, to be honest, Professor Maddock, I was second in command on that case. The hero behind that one is James Rodriguez. He's the one who put the profile together. I just helped. He's been reassigned to a more high-profile task force for the time being, and I won't lie, I feel a little out of my depth at the minute. So that's why we're here now, to ask if you'll help us, I said, honestly.
Help with what?
She asked. The, Showtime Ripper, or Killer, depending on which paper you read, I said bluntly. The professor seemed intrigued.
I must say, despite the awful nature of the crimes, they have fascinated me. I've been following the cases in the media,
she confessed. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff we've kept out of the media. If you agreed to be an official consultant with the FBI BSU, you'd have access to all of the case files. You could also help me interview Robert Cassidy, well, now that Bodkins is tagged out.
I'd have to rearrange my schedule with the university, but I'd love to. It would really aid with my research on child psychopathy and sadistic sexual fantasies in minors. Although, I must ask, what has Robert Cassidy got to do with this case?
She asked, curiously. Well, we left out a lot of details from the news. Just in case the unsub got in touch, we could verify his identity. And there were signs of cannibalism. Now, as you know, we haven't had a serial killer indulge in this sort of behavior since Dahmer. Not one in custody, anyway.
Can't you just type him from dental?
She asked. Well, we tried, but there's no matches on the database. When we catch him, though, we can use it to crucify him in court, I explained.
So you want to know why? Then maybe you'll know why STK does it.
Maddock asked.
I mean, I'm on board regardless. Robert Cassidy, he's the new Bundy. Girls don't know whether they should fear him or fuck him. I mean, I know girls like a bad boy, but I think he's a little extreme for my taste. Each to their own, I guess. But scientists have wanted to know about Cassidy's past and childhood ever since he was captured. No one knows who he was before the event. There's no record of him even being alive prior to 1994 when he was sent to a boarding school in Atlanta. Robert Cassidy was just the name he gave to Georgia Child Services when they found him walking the streets. Any insight into his background before this time would be a publisher's wet dream. Question is, do you think he'll talk to me?
Maddox asked. Yeah. Mainly because he'll want to eat you, I quipped. She didn't know whether to smile or wince.
Shall we head to my office? You can get me up to speed on the case.
Oh, by all means, I'll call the AD at Quantico, make it official, Bodkins declared as we all headed to Ruth Maddox's office. Bodkins and I sat patiently at one side of the desk, while Ruth Maddox went through each of the case files individually and scrupulously. I did my absolute best not to spend the awkward silence fantasizing about myself and Ruth. It wasn't easy, though. My partner of 8 years had left me after I started on the Cassidy task force. The late nights, the staring at photos of sexually mutilated girls all day, the stress, the paranoia, it all took its toll. Well, now I do the same job, but there's no one to go home and unload to. I couldn't help but admire how the professor could stare at the images and see it as simply a jigsaw that needed to be solved. I began to picture us getting married, becoming some sort of power couple who solved violent crimes through the day and made passionate love through the night. When suddenly her analysis caught me off guard.
I have a theory, but that's all it is right now,
she confessed. We leant forward to share our attentiveness.
Any history of abuse allegations or any involvement from social services?
Ruth asked. Bodkins shook his head, confused by the question. In the families? He asked. Ruth nodded.
Yep, in all three.
I chipped in after scanning my mind. No, if anything, quite the opposite. Mother and father, stable marriage, kids did well at school. All of them went to church. Why do you ask?
I thought so. I believe the unsub is targeting families that dispute his belief of what a family should be. The way he singles out the mother with particular hatred suggests he has some sort of strained relationship with his own mother. Perhaps his mother was abusive towards him, or maybe even abandoned him. Seeing a loving mother with her perfect children could really rile him up. The photos of the families he takes will act as souvenirs. He can see them happy and embracing with love. Then he can relive what he did to them. It's something we've seen other similar killers do. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, would steal his victims' driver's licenses and jewelry so he could asphyxiate himself and relive the sexual gratification at a later point.
Well, the interview with Cassidy didn't last long at all, but he did mention something about wanting the mother to feel helpless. Bodkins interjected. Yeah, dehumanized was the word he used, I added.
Really? Gosh, that is an interesting choice of vocabulary. You know, most people who suffer from ASPD, their detachment from empathy starts from a distant relationship with the mother. Our mothers are meant to sing us lullabies when we can't sleep and kiss our scraped knees when we fall down. They show us care and compassion. Someone who spends their childhood being deprived of that has much more risk of developing a detachment from human emotion and values.
Ruth began to venture. So our unsub didn't get enough hugs and kisses. Well, it seems a bit of an extreme reaction, to be honest, Bodkins jeered. Yeah, I'm sure there's more to it. This is something we'll have to press Cassidy about, I said, taking a note in my jotting pad.
I agree. We need to find out what happened in his past that caused him to hate attractive and successful women so much that he wanted to destroy their bodies to such an extreme extent. It could help us see what makes our unsub choose his victims.
I'll contact Perkins at Florence, See if Cassidy is willing to talk again. Well, fingers crossed, we didn't exactly end on good terms, I dwelt. Ruth Maddock flashed a mischievous grin and chuckled.
Tell him that I will be coming. Make a point of my credentials and position. He won't be able to resist. He'll want to fantasize about what sadistic things he'd do to me, and he can't do that unless he sees me. Trust me, it'll work,
she said confidently. If you say so, I'll give you a call when I hear something, I said, reaching across the desk to shake hands with Miss Maddock.
Look forward to it, she
said with that smile that melted my insides. She didn't make a point of doing it. It just felt so genuine, not obligatory, almost like she couldn't help it. I don't know whether it was how she smiled at everyone, but it just felt like it had some depth to it. Old Bodkins went green with envy and barged in to break it up. Yeah, always lovely to see you, Ruth. So glad we're going to be working together again. He held out his hand and offered an embrace. She shook his hand for a brief second and barely made eye contact. I caught a smile that was slipping out.
I look forward to working with you both. Thank you for thinking of me, David,
Ruth said genuinely. We welcomed her and left the university. The rest of the day was spent getting a motel for myself and Bodkins in Denver. Bodkins liaised with Perkins from Florence, and Ruth was right. Perkins told Cassidy an attractive and successful criminologist wanted to visit to interview him, and he was intrigued to say the least. The interview was set for 11 a.m. in 2 days' time. Bodkins and I were going through the case files when the phone rang. I answered it. It was Deputy Director Ray. Evening, sir. What can I do? I was cut off almost instantly. How quickly can you be in Wichita? He asked intensely. 2-3 hours. Why, sir? My question was met with a brief pause of silence followed by a sigh. You struck again, Peter. Part 5. Thankfully, I arrived in Park City rather quickly. By the time I got to Denver International, there was a plane just about to take off. I hopped on, and 100 or so minutes later, I was firing up my rental car and heading to the address in South Wichita. Bodkins stayed in Denver, transcribing the Cassidy interview, going through the evidence files, and liaising with Ruth Maddock, and so on. All the while waiting for me to trust him with something more important and make amends for his actions yesterday. I pulled up across the street from 231 Charleston Drive. There were already emergency services on the scene. Wichita PD, ambulances, Kansas State Coroner's Office, and now me, the sole representative of the FBI. I approached the officer in charge, which was Deputy Officer Jim Meller. I flashed my badge and introduced myself. Special Agent Peter Quince, Behavioral Science Unit. I'm heading up the task force assigned to profiling the unsub responsible for the home invasions. Jim Meller looked too young to be heading up something this high profile. His pasty face and scrawny frame looked like he had much more growing to do, but he had to be at least 22. Well, I simply guessed it was down to poor staff numbers at Wichita PD. Good evening, Agent. Glad to have you on the scene. Do you have any idea of who we should be looking for? The deputy asked. I didn't feel like telling him that I had absolutely jack shit. Well, I've just been assigned. It's early days, but we're looking for a white male, 25 to 35. Someone with a history of sexual abuse. He's likely strong from bodybuilding or perhaps trained in combat sports. Maybe he's served in some sort of military or emergency service. Doesn't mind breaking into a house with another adult male in it. All the men were mid-30s, no more than 175 pounds, average height. He's slightly taller and heavier than the men, but not so much he'd be intimidating. He's potentially worked near the houses before because he's got a good idea of how to get in without making too much noise. I gave him pretty broad strokes. This was basic stuff. I had no idea who we were looking for. So, who are the deceased? I asked. The Bensons. Lived here for years. No history of domestic or sexual abuse with child services. Didn't even drink. The father, Joseph, 38, was tortured before he died from severe blood loss, after his genitals were removed. The 3 kids, Beverly 16, Ashley 12, Michael 8, all died from strangulation. And then the mom, Wendy. The deputy took a minute to gather himself. He almost winced, but caught himself and apologized for not remaining professional. "It's fine, Deputy. You're doing great." "Are you local?" I asked, empathetically. He nodded in spite of his emotions. "Oh, yes, sir. Benjamin Hills, born and bred," he said, proud of his hometown heritage. He added, "Sorry, it's just we don't usually get things like this. Some of the vets at the station, they say they ain't seen a home invasion this disturbing since the Oteros, all the way back in 74. Well, that was way before my time, so this is your first time with this sort of thing?" I once again asked, empathetically. He nodded, shamefully. I put a friendly hand on his shoulder, letting him know it was okay to be bothered by something like this. He picked up his chin, stiffened up his lip, and dusted himself off. "Shall we go inside? Maybe it's best I just show you," the deputy suggested. I gestured for him to lead the way, and we began to make our way into the crime scene. There's always something about knowing a horrific thing has happened in the house that just makes the place feel darker. Like some sort of abyss into the depths of the underworld has formed in its very hallways. "Any sign of forced entry?" I asked, as we made our way through the corridors. Mella nodded cautiously. "We think he got the window open in the kids' room." "Why? You think they knew the killer?" he asked. I didn't answer his question because, I didn't know what to tell him yet. Instead, I peered into the children's bedroom and saw what I was expecting to see. "That's how he got in?" I asked, gesturing towards the open window. "Yeah, we've had that in every house. Our theory is he finds a family, stalks the house, waits for the night when the children's window is open, sneaks in and does his thing." "Stalks the house?" the deputy probed. "Yep. There was a large tree with sturdy branches that overlooked the garden at the first and third houses. Then there was a treehouse at the second. All the houses were single-story, much easier to climb into and not make any noise when you don't need a ladder." "So you don't think he knows the victims personally?" Deputy Miller again asked, as we made our way to the master bedroom. If I had to answer at this point, then I don't think so. 4 sets of victims, all different states. Hard to see how he'd know each set of victims. At this moment, we believe he moves to different areas, maybe for an occupation, where they catch his eye somehow, and then the stalking begins, and then the attack, and then he moves on. I answered, as honestly as I could. The deputy seemed satisfied with the answer. We arrived at the master bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. Inside, the flashing and snapping of a Polaroid camera was going on. "This is Frank Adams. He's a freelance crime scene photographer, one of the best in the business. Frank, this is Special Agent Peter Quince from the Bureau," the deputy said, doing his utmost not to look at the horrific scene on the bed. Frank, however, a seasoned professional, rose to his feet and shook my hand firmly. "Pleasure to meet you, Agent, although I think we've already met," he said with a smile. "Same to you, Mr. Adams." "Really? Have we?" I returned, slightly shocked. "Yeah, I've photographed all the murder scenes so far. You came to the DeVille house last week. I guess us forensic workers all look the same, huh?" he joked. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I feel so rude. Nothing like a hacked-up family to make you lose your manners, eh?" I apologized genuinely. I didn't like the stuck-up federal agent reputation that some law enforcers stuck us with. "That's fine. You'll know for next time, won't you?" he said, slapping a friendly hand on my shoulder. "Or anyway, I'm almost finished. Then I'll be out of your hair. Just need to photograph Mrs. Benson," he added, getting back into position with his camera. "Oh, go right ahead," I invited. Frank Adams smiled and snapped 4 photos of the victim, put the Polaroid photos into an evidence bag, and began to leave the room. I caught him. "Before you leave, could you give me a rundown of the crime scene?" I asked. He put his equipment down on the dressing table and gestured for me to follow him. In my opinion, the unsub entered here, through the window, attacked the children in their beds and subdued them. As he spoke, I made notes. We found this on one of the boys, he said, showing a Polaroid depicting a nasty-looking flesh wound on the oldest child's ribs. If I had to guess, I'd say a pair of pliers. Use them to make the child groan in pain. Unsub hid behind the door, waited for Mr. Benson to enter in haste. Judging by the external bruising on Mr. Benson's neck, I guess a rear chokehold. Mrs. Benson was then at his mercy, he said, holding back a wince. He led us back to the master bedroom then. As you can see, the children were lined up against the east side wall, watching as the unsub raped, tortured, and mutilated the victim, ante-mortem and post-mortem. Once the deed was over, he killed the children by asphyxiating them. Father was also tortured and murdered. As soon as Frank had finished his walkthrough, something caught my ear. Wait, the husband was tortured, I asked, scanning my mind back to the other cases. Frank looked caught off guard by my question. Yeah, not what you were expecting? He asked. Well, last 3 adult male victims showed signs of blunt force trauma to the head, likely to subdue them. And they all died in the same manner as the children, knife wound to the throat. Genitals were removed on the last victim, but that was done post-mortem, I informed. Frank looked at me curiously. But in this case, the husband was tortured just as much as the wife, and the castration occurred ante-mortem. Loss of blood being the cause of death, I added. You thinking he's changing his M.O.? Frank smiled as if to say, great minds think alike, as his question was phrased as more of a statement. Maybe. Part of me thinks this wasn't even the same killer, I said, extravagantly with a bit of a chuckle. Mellor and Adams eyed me curiously. I gestured that I would provide a reason behind my theory. There's a lot more blood on the sheets than the previous 3 victims, indicating that the victim was tortured more ante-mortem than post-mortem. The victim is missing parts of her flesh, but it's been done with blades and pliers. The other victims were bitten. Look at the signs of extreme violence inflicted. It's a complete next level to the other victims. The others were about control and power. This was about hate and anger. It's a similar scene, but the M.O. is totally different. I analyzed this as I scanned the rest of the house. The deputy and the photographer followed me eagerly. Anything missing from the home? I asked. The deputy looked at me and the photographer with a confused look on his face and asked, No, like what? Like a family photo. There was a photo taken from the home in all previous cases. The deputy pouted and began to shake his head, but looked to Frank Adams for confirmation. The photographer backed him up. No, nothing like that. You see, we're operating on the assumption he takes a photo of the family as a trophy. Nothing been taken from the scene, so... what is he using as a souvenir? Well, I was asking anyone who could muster an answer. Frank Adams seemed curious about the criminal mind. He was like the star pupil who always put up his hand in class. What's the purpose of the trophies? Why are they important to the unsub? Adams asked. Violent, sexually motivated criminals commit their acts to feel the sexual gratification they can't achieve in their normal lives. It's not easy planning a kill. A lot of work goes into it. It can be a lengthy process, so to give them a release in the meantime, they relive what they've done by revisiting the scene of their crimes. If they can't do that, though, then the trophies can tide them over. So they are extremely important. I'm really surprised that nothing's missing. Well, my speech began to become more of a thinking pattern that was being spoken. Frank Adams took this opportunity to make his exit. Right, anyway, I best get these photos into evidence. I'll make sure to get you a copy of my report, Agent Quince. Pleasure to meet you. He shook my hand firmly once again. Don't worry, we'll get them, he said with a wink. I smiled back. Yeah, I hope so. Frank Adams left, and I was left with the green as grass Deputy Miller. He didn't seem to be able to stomach much more of the scene. I let him go back to door duty while I rewalked the scene a few more times. Once I'd made notes, recordings, and took photos, I decided to make my way back to Denver. Nothing much else I could do here. I've got everything I need, Deputy. I'm heading back to Denver. Maybe we'll meet again, I said. Really? You think you'll be back? He replied, still clearly shaken by it all. Well, hopefully, we have a project going on right now where we are researching similar offenders to our own sub. Once we're happy with the findings, we'll present a profile to local law enforcement to aim their efforts. So Wichita PD could be one of those departments, I informed him. Jim Mellor smiled. Well, hope so. We get a lot of feds coming down here, acting like their shit don't stink. You've been really understanding to my inexperience. It's been a pleasure meeting you, he said, genuinely. He shook my hand, much less firm than the photographer. I put that down to his age, personality, and experience. I'm pretty new to this stuff too, I confessed. Thankfully, I shadowed one of the best agents in the Bureau when we worked on the CASSIDY case. I've got a degree, but if I'm honest, I learned everything I know from that, I added. My point is, my training wheels haven't been off as long as you'd think, so I know exactly how you feel. But going to 20 crime scenes of violence and rape does make you a little desensitized to it all. And you'll get used to it, I assured him. He scoffed. Not sure I ever want to become a person who's used to shit like that, he confided. I nodded gently in reply, knowing exactly what he meant. I managed to just about catch the red-eye back to Colorado. A few hours of flying and tedious driving later, I was carefully trying to open my motel room door quietly, doing my utmost not to wake Bodkins. I crawled into the other twin bed and curled up facing the wall, drifting off into a shallow 4-hour sleep, all the while dreaming of home invaders and violent rapists. What a life. I barely seemed to have my eyes shut for more than 20 seconds before Bodkins was shaking me awake. I sat up groggy as he passed me an instant coffee that he prepared himself. Thanks, I mustered. Get that down your neck. We'll grab some breakfast and you can tell me everything, Bodkins exclaimed, throwing back the drapes and allowing the Colorado sun to beam into my face. I squinted purposely, signaling to Bodkins that a bit of warning would have been preferred. There was a nice little diner just down the road from my motel. Full buffet and bottomless coffee for $5.99 seemed an absolute steal. We parked up in the booth at the back of the establishment, away from prying eyes and eavesdropping ears. So, is it him? Bodkins asked, shoving a piece of toast into his mouth. Not sure, I answered, as I stared vacantly into my breakfast, pushing a piece of bacon into the egg yolk. Bodkins stopped chewing long enough to cock his head in puzzlement. But D.D. Race said that... It was very similar. Unsub came through the window, subdued the kids, lured the husband into an attack, made them watch the mother's ordeal, then killed the witnesses. I laid it out for him. So, what are the differences then? He asked, intrigued. Well, the main victim wasn't left in the same hog roast position. Just laid on her back. The wounds were all inflicted with instruments rather than teeth. She had all sorts of wounds to her skin and flesh. All the sodomy and destruction of her reproductive organs occurred when she was alive. I didn't even think she'd been raped. I've requested an autopsy to confirm. Additionally, the husband had also been tortured, arguably just as much as the wife. He'd been sodomized as well with one of the children's toys. Oh, and the children. The throats weren't slit. They'd been asphyxiated. Well, the scene is the same, but the details are so different. Oh, there were no photos taken. I decided to leave it there as I could see Bodkins was struggling to keep up. Yeah, sorry, it's been a long night, I added. Or maybe he's just changing his MO. Wouldn't be the first time a killer did that to throw off the investigators, would it? Bodkins pondered, Well, I guess not, but I sighed with hesitancy. There's using a knife instead of a gun, or dumping a body in the woods instead of the lake, but well, this was different. The level of violence inflicted was to cause serious agony. It wasn't to humiliate or dehumanize. This was out of serious hate. I don't know. It's all mixed up in my head, I said, taking a huge gulp of coffee. Maybe just take the morning. Relax your mind. Wait for the reports to come through from Wichita PD. It'll make more sense, Bodkins said, sounding like the occupational therapist at Quantico. Maybe you're right, I said with a sigh of acceptance. Anyway, Ruth wanted us to head up to the university again today. Make up a questionnaire for the CASSIDY interview. Plus, she's intrigued to hear about the Bensons. Okay, let's finish our food and get our files and we'll head up, I told Bodkins, finishing the last of my coffee. And we shoved the rest of the bacon in our mouths, got a refill for the road, and made our way back to the hotel. Bodkins played the good soldier and took the scenic route to the university, allowing me to have a much-needed power nap in the passenger seat. I couldn't help but feel conscious about my appearance as we made our way to Ruth Maddox's office. I was hoping I didn't look too tired before scolding myself for thinking like a 15-year-old schoolboy. When we entered the office, Ruth was just finishing marking her students' papers.
Good morning, gentlemen. How are we?
She asked, her bubbliness that of a person who had had at least 8 hours sleep. I envied her. Ready to get into it, Bodkins exclaimed. Ready to get into bed, I confessed. Ruth chuckled.
Yeah, I can see. You just get back from Wichita?
5 a.m., I said, causing her to wince for me. I smiled in return, appreciating her making me feel at ease. I could see Bodkins going green with envy out of the corner of my eye as we shared the moment, and I grinned even more.
So we can add the Bensons to the list of victims of the Showtime killer?
She asked, objectively, looking through the files I'd placed on her desk. Quincy's not sure, Bodkins chirped up. Ruth shot her head up to look at me with surprise.
Really?
She asked. Wichita thinks he's just changed his MO to stay ahead of the police. But there's just something that doesn't sit with me. I mean, go ahead and look at my notes and give me your opinion, I invited, waving my palm out towards the files. Ruth's expression told me she was accepting the invitation, and we then waited patiently for her expert opinion. Around 20 minutes later, she closed the file, knocked the papers back into a neat pile against her desk, and bluntly said,
I agree. This isn't him.
Bodkins and I both looked up in surprise. Well, Bodkins was more confused, whereas I was more relieved. I knew I wasn't reading too much into it. You really think so? I asked, fishing for confirmation.
Absolutely. It'll be interesting to see the autopsy report. I'll lay you good odds that she wasn't raped.
She sounded confident. I was intrigued. I gave Bodkins a "I told you so" grin. What makes you say that? Bodkins probed. I pulled my chair forward to show my interest.
The first 3 victims were beaten, raped, and stabbed. The bites to the flesh, stab wounds, and the insertion of foreign objects into the anus and vagina was all done post-mortem. Whereas here, our unsub not only doesn't take the trophy, but he tortures Mrs. Benson sadistically. He tears her flesh with the pliers, cuts her, stabs her, burns her, violates, penetrates, and sodomizes her with the bedpost. All this is done ante-mortem. He does the same with Mr. Benson, too, destroys his flesh with the hardware, then castrates him and sodomizes him with a children's toy as he lays bleeding to death. Then the children have been asphyxiated, not lacerated. Look at the bruising on the tip of the noses.
She pointed at the photo which depicted a close-up of the children's faces. Bodkins and I looked in closely, remaining professional and hiding our contempt for whatever monster had done this. Well, say what you want about Robert Cassidy, but he never harmed a child.
I read the reports on the first 3 victims. The children had their throats sliced, but the pathologist reports indicate the unsub was right-handed, and the wounds were inflicted from left to right. But here, that bruising indicates the killer used a bag and applied the pressure from behind, meaning...
He didn't want to look at him, I answered out loud, following Ruth's thought pattern.
Exactly. The first 3 victims were all made to look into their killer's eyes when he slit their throats.
Ruth explained. Well, not exactly the behavior of the Showtime killer. The killer who loves an audience, Bodkin said, finally starting to get on board.
I think this was someone with a grudge and dressed it up to make it look like the work of a high-profile murderer. This is below our radar, if you ask me. If STK is out there, then he's planning another murder soon. The hot nights are coming to an end soon. Less people leaving their windows open. He'll have to make a move soon.
Ruth speculated, just as my phone pinged, signifying I had an email. Well, you were right. Pathologist's report just came through. No signs of conventional rape, I informed her.
Could you forward the reports from Wichita to my email? I'd like to go over them in my own time, if that's okay.
Ruth asked. I gestured I was happy to do it and sent on the documents.
Is anything on why none of the victims managed to call the police?
Ruth questioned. Well, the first 3 houses, all the phone lines were cut, so they couldn't use the landlines. However, it's 2017. Why wouldn't they use their mobiles right? Well, I did a bit of digging into complaints to cell phone companies on the nights of the murders in the surrounding area. There's a spike in complaints to each of the top providers around the times of the murders from the neighboring streets. I think he uses a signal blocker, I hypothesized.
Fair assumption.
Ruth admitted, giving me a look of awe and admiration. I couldn't help perk up in my seat. So, what are we doing about Cassidy? Bodkins asked, his jealous side desperately trying to change the subject.
Well, I've made up a first draft questionnaire that I want both your inputs on,
Ruth informed, pulling a piece of paper out of her desk. She began to go through the bullet points and what she wanted to obtain from Cassidy. Meanwhile, I started to daydream and stare at the map of the USA on the office wall. 3rd murder, Nebraska. 2nd murder, Oklahoma. 1st murder, Texas. I began to speak out loud, waiting for someone to catch on to my train of thoughts. 4th murder, Wichita. They make a line, but they're not in order, I continued. Do you not think that's a little strange? I asked. Ruth began to see what I was talking about.
I really don't think it's an accident that all these states are neighboring. Imagine you are a serial killer. You know if your name turns up on flight records to other states in patterns around a murder timeline, you know it's going to lead them to you, sooner or later. So you drive to a neighboring city, commit your crime, then move on to the next.
Ruth speculated. When Cassidy killed his victims, he never killed anyone in Texas while he lived there, I added. So, maybe he left out Kansas because it's a little too close to home? Bodkins joined in. Or maybe it is his home, I thought out loud again.
But then why go back and do the murder there anyway?
Ruth proposed. Well, I thought we were assuming this wasn't our guy, I challenged. And this made Bodkins and Ruth meet my gaze, and you could hear everyone's gears in their head begin to turn.
It's important we don't get tunnel vision here. This pattern could be purely coincidental,
Ruth reminded us. Well, I'll request a background check on the Bensons. Maybe it'll give us the information we need, I said, pulling out my phone and making a call to Wichita PD. The phone rang a few times before a female voice answered. Good morning, Wichita Police Department. Desk Sergeant Rosie Conwell speaking, a friendly voice said. Good morning, Sergeant Conwell. It's Special Agent Peter Quince from the Behavioral Science Unit at the FBI. I consulted on one of your crime scenes last night and... The Bensons, she asked bluntly, cutting me off. Yes, that's correct. I'd like to request a background check on the deceased, if I may. I politely requested. I'll consult the officer on the scene, then I'll put it together and forward it on to you, she told me. Ah yes, Deputy Meller. I've met him. Nice guy, I informed her. She took my email and told me I'd have the report within the next 24 hours. I thanked her and hung up. We should know more by tomorrow morning at latest, I informed the group.
Okay then, let's get back to Mr. Cassidy,
Ruth said, clicking her pen and gesturing back towards the questionnaire, preparing for what would no doubt be a taxing interview tomorrow. So things are really starting to hot up now and get very, very interesting. I hope you agree. So, yes, a bit of a cock-up on the editing front from me, which means that this isn't going to be a 3-night thing, it's going to stretch to 4 nights. So we had episode 1 yesterday, this is episode 2. There was going to be episode 3 only, but now it's going to be 3 and 4. So it's going to be a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Epic piece of entertainment for you. So I really hope you're enjoying this, because it's going to be the next 2 nights as well. Ooh, things really are getting good, aren't they? Of course they are. Of course you're loving this, aren't you? Just as much as I am. Well, my dear friends, that is enough for me for one evening, but I will definitely be back again tomorrow with this. So, until tomorrow evening, you're coming back, aren't you? Go on, tell me you are. Yes, you are. Yes, yes. Till tomorrow evening, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or 2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams, and bye-bye.